John O. Rasmussen, and I'm 90 years old and the proud grandfather of Derek Rasmussen by my side.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I was married in 1950 to Louise Brooks, and we had 4 children, and our youngest being Derek's father, Steve. I was born in St. Petersburg, Florida in August 8th, 1926, the year before Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. Well, I'm first generation on my father's line. My father was born in Denmark and immigrated with his parents through Ellis Island when he was 11 years old in 1908. My mother's family goes back a good many more generations in the United States. Yes, I was in the Navy. I'd enlisted at age 17, just before the Normandy invasion, and taken radar training, and was at the Brooklyn Navy Yard waiting the completion of an aircraft carrier that I would be on the crew of. The bombs were obviously a game changer for the world, and horrifying as it was to lose, to kill so many people, it probably saved lives. Invasion of Japan, if that had been required. Yeah, it was a very sad time. I mean, I can remember being at tears at watching the television. And I have to tell a little of the story where I was. I was at the radiation lab in Berkeley, and when the news came through, and it happened that the professor I had worked for as a student earlier, Glenn Seaborg, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, was showing 2 Russian visitors around the laboratory when that news came through. And so there was a lot of consternation. We didn't know who had perpetrated the assassination and whether Russians might be involved. And they flew off to Yosemite Park with the Russians, and we carried on. There might not have been the Vietnam War might have been wound down if it were not for that. Yeah, the Vietnam War was an avoidable mistake. The Cold War was on with Russia and China on the communist side, and the philosophy of containment of the communist side was part of the rationale. I think that brought Kennedy to start increasing our involvement in helping South Vietnam. I was, I was already on the faculty at the University of California in Berkeley, and with colleagues that were opposed to the Vietnam War as it escalated. We had sent protests to the government when the bombing of Hanoi took place under Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy was assassinated. And then I took part in mid-70s there was a Vietnam Day march down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and several of my colleagues in physics and chemistry were in the march. We were warned you might be arrested and so on and so forth, but we joined that protest march. One was my friend, Nobel laureate, and another was a graduate student who later got a Nobel Prize. So I was walking with about a dozen guys, and we mailed a letter to the New York Times. The press was saying, oh, this is just a bunch of red flag waving rebels in Berkeley, and we said, no, we're serious members of the school that believe the Vietnam War is a mistake. Well, I was on the faculty at Yale University at the time, and it was a very exciting time. We didn't have a television where I lived, but we went down to the accelerator lab where there was a very large screen television and watched the landing and felt great pride in our country's technical achievement. Well, my wife and I was spending a couple of months in Japan working on research, and we were given a little bit of vacation before I went to work at the lab near Tokyo. And we were actually down in the island of Kyushu on a tour bus when the news came through that Nixon had resigned. Of course, we had followed on the radio before as that evolved. So, yeah, mixed feelings. Too bad that it happened, but Nixon had made too many mistakes, and I think it was some relief that he stepped down. Well, that was an exciting time. I had been spending time at one of the labs near Munich, Garching, on a Humboldt Fellowship. And yeah, there was a lot of celebration when the wall came down, and one of my former students and her husband he was on sabbatical in Berlin, so they actually were there. I had earlier spent 6 months after I graduated from Caltech in 1948. We had spent time in Salzburg, Austria, and so we had some feeling for the wall, the separation, and so on, and it was welcomed at the time. Yes, when it fell. Well, that was indeed a horror. We had been up at the top of the Trade Center in April. We were back in New York for a week for the wedding of a nephew that lived there, and so, you know, it was a great tragedy, and set loose many of the great problems that the countries have suffered since then with the suicide bombing terrorists and so on. That was a very bad step as the extremists adopted suicide tactics. Well, I'm very thankful for the combination of good times and good luck to have found a good woman in my wife, whom I married in 1950. I had been very impressed to hear that, the summer before we met, that she had gone with a Quaker work camp in Mexico to help out the peasants there. And so we've been blessed with generally good luck and 4 fine children, one of which, our daughter Jane, had died of cancer 5 years ago, but she had worked for the United Nations and hellholes all over the world, Rwanda and Yemen and the Northeast Congo, and finally it was cancer that brought her down. But her son and his wife and their 2 children, our little great-granddaughters, and living in Virginia, are a happy part of our life. We've been lucky to live this long.
Thank you.